government action is, without serious rethinking of the job support scheme, they're papering cracks in a seawall just before the tsunami hits. If this government won't act, they should provide the Scottish Government with the fiscal lever that Scotland needs to take the right decisions to protect jobs, lives, wherever necessary. The decisions on available support are not carved in stone. They're made up by a small group of people with big responsibilities on their shoulders. It is a political choice, and it's a short-sighted one from this government at the moment from the actions that they're not taking. The Scottish Government calculates extending furlough would save 61,000 jobs in Scotland. The good news is that these are decisions that can be rethought, and I would urge the Government to do so for the sake of all our futures.
Davis Jones.
Diolch yn fawr, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is an honour to follow the member for Midlothian. I share a lot of his concerns, and I think it is vital that we recognise that the numbers often quoted in this place relate to actual real people with real bills to pay and with real children to look after. The Chancellor, given his absence yesterday, may not be aware that my local authority of Rhondda and Taff has been under local coronavirus restrictions for some weeks now, so I can speak with specific experience. Hundreds of people across Pontypridd feel utterly failed by the Chancellor and this government. Colleagues across the House will know that this is not the first financial hardship that my community has faced this year. Pontypridd, along with the member, my friend for Cynon Valley, and the member for the Rhondda's communities, were hit with some of the worst flooding ever recorded only 8 months ago. Storm Dennis decimated parts of our constituencies earlier this year, and the Prime Minister has said that funds would be passported to help us rebuild. Where is that money? And it just shows you how much stock can be placed in the promise from this government. All of these months later, and we and our communities are still waiting. This is absolutely disgraceful and shows just how little care this government has for the people of Wales. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is still pursuing a one-size-fits-all approach to protecting jobs during this pandemic. The Labour Party has now been calling for a sector-specific support deal for months now, and still this government hasn't accepted responsibility and hasn't put a plan in place to support these industries. We know that the aviation sector is facing specific and substantial challenges because of the virus. In Pontypridd, major employers including GE Aviation in Nantgarw and British Airways in Llantrisant have sadly been forced to make redundancies. Across this country, 1.6 million people's jobs and livelihoods rely on the aviation sector. We cannot just let these jobs disappear. The coach industry too is facing specific challenges as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Like aviation, this is a seasonal industry that is very reliant on tourism. Industry experts estimate up to 4 in 10 companies could be bust, and 27,000 jobs could be lost if no support is made available. This will hit communities hard, as many of these companies are family-owned small businesses, like Edwards Coaches and Ferris's Coaches in my own constituency. It really doesn't have to be this way. This government has the opportunity to save jobs with sector-specific support packages, but instead has decided to proceed with an economic support package that clearly isn't fit for purpose. The High Street is also feeling the strain. Just this week, the group that owns Peacocks, a significant employer in my constituency, announced that they are appointing administrators. Across this country, this puts 24,000 jobs at risk, and other well-known High Street brands are feeling the strain too. River Island recently closed their store in Pontypridd High Street after being doubly hit, first by flooding from Storm Dennis and then by the coronavirus pandemic. And Pontypridd High Street is sadly not alone. And then there's still the problem of all the people who've been left out of the government support altogether. Earlier this week, I asked the Minister about support for people who've been excluded from the government support schemes, and his response said that the government had covered the issue. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say that the 3 million people who have been excluded from UK government support during the coronavirus pandemic don't feel like this issue has been covered at all. When will this government take some responsibility? You cannot govern with 11th hour announcements and leaks to the press. People in areas under local restrictions need clarity and guidance, not slapdash announcements that haven't even been thought through. I urge the Chancellor and the Minister to deeply consider their priorities going forward, because our constituents all deserve a secure economic future, and people across Wales deserve better than to be consistently forgotten and betrayed by this government.
Louis Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Government has already conceded that fighting the spread of this dangerous COVID-SARS virus in our country requires extraordinary levels of state action and support. But now, just as the fight is intensifying, it's clear that they've lost their nerve. We're not only battling this deadly virus, the Prime Minister is fighting his own libertarian instincts and the right-wing ideologues in his own party, They're opposed to the collective state action which is necessary to save lives and mitigate the damage from the pandemic. The delay this fight caused in March left us with a double whammy of the highest per capita death toll in Europe and on top of the largest economic hit in the G7. And now this unforgivable dereliction of duty looks like it's happening again. As the Prime Minister dithers, the virus spreads. His failure to take timely and firm action will cost more lives and wreak more damage on our economy. As he courts his mutinous backbenchers and abandons the science to keep them sweet, all the warning signs are flashing red again. He's behind the curve and he knows it. And since the Sage Minutes were published on Monday night, we all know it too. The government has lost the trust it needs to lead the fight against this deadly threat. Its partisan, high-handed behaviour has made it worse, excluding Parliament completely, constant briefings to the media, an obsession with outsourcing and centralisation, which has caused the failure of test and trace and the scandal of PPE supplier contracts to Tory donors. And now, we will do whatever it takes, has turned into the inadequate furlough light proposals which the Chancellor has recently come up with. Just as the virus returns, he's packed up the safety net. For my constituents in Wallasey, who are now in Tier 3 and facing a local lockdown, vital support disappears at the end of the month. In Wirral, 31,000 people are still on furlough and it will disappear at the end of the month just as the virus comes roaring back. What replaces it is completely inadequate, as the Chancellor knows only too well. And those who are losing their jobs or their business don't want a lecture from the Chancellor about how much is already spent. Those who are excluded completely from this support, in the first place, the freelancers, some of the self-employed, they don't want that lecture either. They want a government which will recognise the hardship the pandemic has caused and be there to help. The least the government could have done was to repurpose the 40 million in unspent support allocated to the Liverpool City region, which is now in Tier 3, to support local businesses. But just again today, the Chancellor has refused even this modest request. Those forced to self-isolate to stop the spread of the virus need the support to do so, and not to have to choose between feeding their family and obeying the rules. Wirral Borough Council, which has been in the forefront of the fight against the virus, have not been reimbursed for what it's cost, and like many other local authorities, they're teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. So what do we need? We need an increase in generosity of the furlough light scheme. It's got to pay more to those whose jobs are affected. We need wider eligibility. It's got to go to businesses who are affected, not only those who close. We need to include the excluded, which means freelancers and the self-employed. And we need to pay adequate sick pay for those forced to isolate. If we don't do this, Madam Deputy Speaker, the virus will roar back and the economic cost will, in the end, be far greater, and the cost in lives will be unbearable.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I want to focus on the forgotten, those who've been forgotten by this government in my constituency, but also right across the country. And there are 3 million who are excluded, not to mention the 4 million who are now reliant on the flawed universal credit system. In Oxford, West and Abingdon, the claimant rate has increased by 255% since March. And what scares me about all of this is that here we are again. Here we are again. They all suffered when we went into lockdown. We had meetings after meetings where we were raising these issues with this government. And we were told that if we do this, if we clump together and we clap for our frontline workers every Thursday and we will get through this. And yet here we are with now a 3-tier system, what I think is inevitably going to lead to another lockdown, because what we're hearing is that the government has started to abandon listening to the scientists and are instead following this strange balancing act where they're trying to present it as if it was Goldilocks, the best of both worlds, when in fact we have some of the highest case numbers per capita in Europe and some of the poorest performing economic metrics. This is the worst of all possible worlds, not the best. And from my constituency, like many others, there are just some horrific stories. A director of a small gym in my constituency, who is a small company, pays himself by PAYE and dividends, and is petrified of seeing what's happening in the north with the closing of gyms and wondering what's going to happen now. Is there going to be continuing no safety net? And he's worried about going out of business altogether. You know, these are the 99% of businesses in our country that form the backbone of our economy. And once they close, as the Minister and the Chancellor will well know, it's much more difficult for them to start up again. I have a constituent who is working 2 jobs because neither of them is enough to pay the cost of living. And she gets nothing now because 47% of her income is from being self-employed. But the thing that's most striking about her correspondence with me, Madam Deputy Speaker, and also of my constituent Christopher, who works in the creative arts industry, is that real sense of fear and deteriorating mental health. If you read the emails from the beginning of March to now, you can see that they are tetchy. They then apologise to me for the tone of their emails, and it's not me that they should be apologising to. It's the Chancellor and the Minister and this government who should be apologising to them because of the stress that they are going under. Because for Christopher, he's not earned a penny since March. And the point he makes is he has spent his whole life paying his taxes. He has a contract with this country. And throughout this whole period, he feels that, and yes, I totally agree, we need to improve furlough, we need to have sector by sector bailouts if we need to, but for Christopher, he's received absolutely nothing. He's supporting his wife, his 2 children. He's paid his taxes the whole of his life, and he feels completely abandoned. And now he is talking about feeling depressed and anxious, and the long-term effect that the lack of support from this government is going to have on people's mental health is one of the consequences of this pandemic that I don't think we are taking seriously enough. So I hope for those constituents and others across the country who are hearing these speeches from the opposition benches at least, they know they are not being forgotten, even if they might be being excluded by this government. And all I would like to say is a plea on their behalf. Please, this is not dealt with. Yes, there are support packages for others, but it hasn't reached them.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon, who I agree with on so many of the points that she makes. In my constituency of Jarrow, people have been living under local restrictions for over a month without any clear support package in place. The Chancellor's indecisiveness has left workers and businesses all across constituencies, and particularly in all areas under local restrictions, in complete limbo, often confused by ever-changing rules and regulations. And it's no secret that wealthy areas, including the Chancellor's own parliamentary seat of Richmond, are avoiding lockdown despite higher Covid-19 rates than less wealthy areas that are subject to restrictions. It begs the question, if London and the south of England had been asked to live under the same restrictions as those implemented in the north, would the government have found new strategies a long time ago? This utterly stinks of classism and serial incompetence at the heart of this government. And the empty benches opposite tell me how much this government aren't listening. The Chancellor has made a U-turn of sorts, but people in my constituency have already suffered, and for many this has come far too late. It feels to many like an intentional managed decline. This isn't levelling up, it's levelling down. Take the example of Kieran, a bar manager in my constituency who got in touch, heartbroken that his bar has turned from a hiring business to a firing business in the weeks since the local restrictions were introduced. Kieran's business saw infection rates staying stable for the 2 months after reopening. So like many of us, he's at a loss as to understand why the hospitality industry is being made a scapegoat for the rise in cases when no concrete evidence has been produced by the government to prove that this is the case, despite this being repeatedly asked for by all sides of this House. There's nothing new here for the self-employed, nothing again for those who have been excluded from the start, and nothing for businesses that aren't forced to close but who are suffering because of their local restrictions. In fact, some local hospitality businesses and others have told me that they would rather be in Tier 3 than Tier 2 due to the lack of financial support. The Chancellor's chaotic habit of trying to fix problems of his own making at the last possible minute is costing jobs and causing chaos, and the UK is on course for a 1980s-style jobs crisis, and the Chancellor's name is all over it. I fully support the proposals by the Shadow Front Bench that would put in place a job recovery scheme that fixes the problems that so many employers can keep more staff on. If the Chancellor's current plans are not reformed, millions of people will be pushed into unemployment, and yet the government will still be required, of course, to offer financial support through many benefits like the inadequate universal credit. Households will feel the squeeze, and the prospects for recovery will be hampered by a lack of income and low confidence amongst British households. The legacy from the last period of mass unemployment already casts a shadow over the British economy, particularly in the north, and I can only imagine what the legacy of the Prime Minister and this government will look like. Nobody is asking for the furlough scheme to go on forever, but workers and jobs must be protected if we are to return to any kind of normality when we finally defeat this virus. Put the correct levels of support in place, make the correct political decisions, and save jobs by supporting all businesses, no matter the size or the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my fellow North East MP. The UK has one of the highest Covid-19 death rates in the world, thousands of lives lost, and families have been torn from their loved ones far too soon. The UK is also on track to have one of the worst recessions, with millions out of work and people looking for employment in the most hostile conditions imaginable. Yesterday it was announced that the UK unemployment rate had surged to its highest level for over 3 years at 4.5%. The disastrous mix of the pandemic and the Tory incompetence continues to decimate our jobs market. But while the national picture is devastating, what is happening in North East England is utterly catastrophic. We have amongst the highest mortality rate for deaths involving Covid-19, and our unemployment rate has soared to 6.6%, the worst in the UK. As Niamh Concorin of the North East Chamber of Commerce said yesterday, the North East now finds itself with the highest unemployment rate, the lowest employment rate and the lowest average hours worked of all British regions. She went on, although the government amendments to the job support scheme offer some support for our region in the event of tighter restrictions, it doesn't go far enough. For thousands of families, their income is precarious, dwindling or has disappeared. And new child poverty statistics released today by the End Child Poverty Coalition show that the North East has seen the biggest rise in child poverty. In my own and next door constituency of Stockton South, the proportion of children living in poverty has risen to 34% and 29% respectively, with others in the Tees Valley higher still. These aren't empty statistics, Madam Deputy Speaker, but represent thousands of living, breathing children plunged into poverty as a result of poorly paid jobs or no jobs at all for their families. The Tees Valley is hemorrhaging jobs. 12,565 have been lost since March, and thousands more are now destined for the scrap heap, thanks to the Tory response. Yet businesses in Tier 2 lockdown, like those in my constituency, have no safety net whatsoever. They're not legally mandated to close, yet we know for a fact that many of them will, and many of them won't open again. They will have few, if any, customers, but they will get no proper support from the government. Simon Longbottom, CEO of the Stonegate Pub Company, that has 10 pubs in my constituency, said, "Whilst we are continually working to protect jobs, with every new instruction from government, our delicate business balance fractures further." Even businesses that are mandated to close will only get partial support for wages. This could only mean another wave of job losses. Across the Tees Valley in the North East, we're crying out for serious and sustained economic investment. Our Tory Metro Mayor promised job creation for the Tees Valley, but he's spent £100,000 on each job he's created in the last 3 years. Then there's Hoochingate. The Tory mayor proudly donned his hard hat to announce he's spending £1 million on a new gate to an industrial estate with few jobs, if any. That £1 million, Madam Deputy Speaker, could have provided 100 vulnerable businesses with a £10,000 lifeline and probably saved many of them from closure. Sadly, it's been spent on a gate, and there's no protection scheme for jobs. For every job announced in the last 3 years, 5 have been lost in the last 6 months. We need a serious vision from the government, one that isn't just about creating a few eye-wateringly expensive new jobs, but about protecting the good jobs that already exist. If the government doesn't act, not only will we see the poor suffer even more in our communities like mine in Stockton North, but many families who have never experienced poverty in their lives will be experiencing it for the first time. That is not a place we as a country want to be going.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the last 7 months, we've obviously had an extremely difficult time for individuals, families and communities right across our country. So I want to start by paying tribute to those in my constituency who have kept our economy and our community going. Key workers and community groups have pulled together in an incredibly resourceful and compassionate way to get us through these difficult times. While local businesses have turned their hands to manufacturing PPE at the drop of a hat and showcased an amazing amount of skill and flexibility, it's been an inspiration to witness. Yet many of my Aberavon constituents have been badly let down by the cracks in government schemes or by incoherent UK government communications. For instance, holidays are not seen as a reasonable excuse to leave a lockdown area, yet because the flights are going ahead, some travel companies and insurers are refusing to give refunds or payout. One constituent of mine lost £1,800 on a trip to Turkey by trying to do the right thing in staying home, and another faced hardship over a trip to Portugal. I'd like to hear what the government's doing to apply pressure on these firms and to compensate customers where the firm has gone bust. There's also still a lack of support for self-employed people during local lockdowns, while many of Aberavon's pubs and hospitality firms are also increasingly concerned that they're not receiving sufficient compensation. The Chancellor needs to recognise these problems and listen to our front bench, who have been constructive and consistent throughout this process. Labour has stated clearly that the government should put in place a job recovery scheme that fixes the problems with the government schemes so that employers can keep more staff on rather than having to let people go, that ensures that no one on the scheme falls into poverty, and that is open to all businesses impacted by the restrictions. We need the government to recognise the large number of holes in its recovery plan and for it to actively strive to fill in those holes rather than simply ticking the boxes and turning away. That's why Labour is stating clearly that a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker lockdown should be accompanied by the reopening of the government's closed £1.3 billion fund, using the underspend to support businesses in need. Madam Deputy Speaker, by far the biggest employer in my constituency is the Port Talbot Steelworks. Yet Tata Steel has fallen through the cracks in government schemes and is yet to receive a single penny of COVID-related support. Steel workers are key workers. The steel industry is continuing to operate and to serve Britain through the current crisis as we look to rebuild our economy. It is the foundation of our entire manufacturing sector. We need our steel, but the industry can only get through this crisis with urgent support from government. Make no mistake about it, steel underpins our entire manufacturing sector, from defence to aerospace to automotive to construction. It builds resilience and reliance into our economy. It is also far greener to make steel in the UK than to import it, and there are some fantastic projects such as Specific happening in my constituency, which is about creating photovoltaic cells with a steel-based film. The government must offer long-term support to steel in the form of a sector deal, such as the one that aerospace and construction have. But they must first of all offer immediate short-term support to get us through this crisis. The message is clear. We need our steel. Steel is a 21st century industry that forms the backbone of our economy, and there can be no post-pandemic economic recovery without a strong and healthy steel industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday I received the latest claimant figures for my constituency. Liverpool Riverside's rate of claimants has doubled since the pandemic began in March. The joblessness in my constituency is 1 in 5, including those, like many of the excluded UK members, who don't feature as they are unable to claim any support whatsoever. And now that Liverpool has been declared a Tier 3 zone, our leisure, gyms and hospitality sectors are being forced to close. Across Liverpool, there are approximately 30,000 people employed in this sector, and all face at least 4 weeks without work. The job support scheme offers less support than comparable schemes in other countries, and it will only provide 67% of earnings and will force many people into poverty. And the point has been made this week by colleagues that bills, rent, food costs are not reducing by 67% to match this. And for those who are self-employed and reliant on the hospitality and leisure industries for business, their support reduces to just 10%. I watched the interview with Natalie Hayward on ITV this week, owner of The Leaf and Oh Me, Oh My, 2 of our city's leading hospitality independent, and it was heartbreaking to watch her under such despair over the fact that, having fought hard to recover from the first lockdown, she is now faced with losing the iconic businesses she has built up, and worse, possibly having to lay off her staff. And she is far from alone. Another interview with an owner, Lunya, a business that has paid over 10 million in taxes in its 10-year history, employs dozens of local people, has adapted the businesses to ensure survival throughout this first lockdown, and he now risks losing his business and his home. Yellow Sub, one of the best-loved children's indoor play areas, one of the last businesses allowed to open, missed the busy summer season and will now miss the half-term, putting their business in jeopardy, axing jobs and more people without work. Many of these businesses access the government grants in the first lockdown, and they saved their businesses, reopening even on a limited capacity basis in September. This unforeseen enforced lockdown without that support has left them reeling and looking at the bleakest of futures. Liverpool's hospitality and leisure industries are critical to our economy. As one of the top 5 UK destinations, the sector contributes £5 billion to the Merseyside economy and sustains 50,000 jobs. Forcing this entire sector to close for an indefinite period without the financial support available, as in the first lockdown, will decimate our city and our region. And I must pay thanks to our Metro Mayor Steve Rotherham and the 6 local authority leaders for pulling together a 40 million support scheme for this sector, without which we would undoubtedly be facing a domino effect of shutdowns in our city centre. But we need more. The local restrictions grant scheme won't provide enough to cover the overheads of most of our small independent businesses, the ones that make Liverpool so unique. I call on the government to repay the city the unspent discretionary grant fund and allow us to invest in our economy. I'm a very proud Scouser and privileged to represent such a resilient city that always fights back to protect its people. But let's have a fair fight. Give us the money we need to protect jobs and livelihoods and keep our economy going, and we will respond by supporting our businesses, our workforces, and come back stronger. Thank you.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Never has a relationship between the health of a nation and the wealth of a nation been laid quite so bare as these past 6 months. We were promised world beating by this Prime Minister and his Health Secretary, and we got it. Not only has the UK seen the worst death rate per 100,000, but it's also seen the worst economic impact of G20 nations. In response to calls from Labour and the TUC, the government wisely introduced the furlough scheme, and the initial financial support from the government was a lifeline to many of my constituents. 16,000 people in Warwick and Leamington were furloughed. Business grants and loans kept our local economy going, and the District Council was superb in how they did that. But why then, as we head into a second wave, is the government hell-bent on pulling the plug on that support? On the 11th of March, the Chancellor promised to do whatever it takes, but the job support scheme incentivises keeping 1 employee on instead of 2. People working for businesses that are closed under local lockdowns will receive no more than 2/3 of their salaries, even on a minimum wage. Can you imagine? The minimum wage is no longer a minimum. The Winter Economy Plan offers no additional support for those businesses who are required to close. There is no support for those viable businesses severely hampered by the ongoing situation. There is still no answer to the calls of the 3 million taxpayers who have been largely excluded from financial support since the beginning of this crisis, and the offer to self-employed people of 20% of average monthly profits is miserly. Madam Deputy Speaker, you only have to look at the chart and data published by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, an independent international body, that shows how the UK was the hardest hit of any major economy from April to June. Growth is slowing, and the economy is still 9% smaller than before the pandemic struck. Our unemployment rate has hit the highest level in over 3 years. Our young people have been hardest hit, but across our communities we know there are many more job losses to come. The number of claimants in my constituency is already up 135% since the start of this pandemic. Whole sectors have been flattened. Automotive manufacturing, which is so important to my constituency and many others, was brought to a standstill. It has had its worst September sales this century, and this is resulting in the UK industry facing massive financial pressure. But across the economy, from our assembly workers to our energy engineers, our brewers to our baristas, our dancers to our designers, all too many fear losing their jobs. But it didn't need to be this way. If we look at those countries who have had the strongest economies now, it is those countries that took clear early action to suppress and eradicate the virus. China, Taiwan, and other Asia-Pacific economies are on course to grow in 2020. They took early action to suppress Covid-19 to extremely low levels and put in place highly performing track and trace systems. The only consistency from this government was its inconsistency. Barbers could work, but beauticians couldn't. You could spend 4 hours alongside 300 people on an aeroplane, but not with 50 people on a coach or bus. The government had the whole summer to produce a plan for schools, a plan for universities, a plan for care homes, and most importantly, to fix, test and trace. It instead spent its time telling us to eat out, to help out, and it blew its budget. We could have eradicated this virus with a proper strategy, but the government dithered and delayed. It ignored the approaches from PPE manufacturers in my constituency. Businesses like Steger Clear Plastics in Coventry, Techman more locally to me. These were businesses that could have helped us through,